Chapter 9, The Confederation and the Constitution. Introduction. In this chapter, we're going to learn about the first two forms of self-government that the colonists employed after they had won the Revolution. You may not have known that there were two forms. The first one didn't last long, which necessitated creating another one. We will learn about first the limitations of the Revolution. The Revolution, as revolutionary as it was, didn't suddenly or radically overturn the social and political framework in which the colonists, now transformed into citizens and Americans, had been living. We will examine these limitations of the Revolution. Just because they won militarily didn't mean that they were suddenly transposed into a new republic all by itself. Next, we're going to learn about the Revolution's fertile ground. Yes, it is true that winning the military part of the Revolution was absolutely necessary. And it did provide a fertile ground, you might say a blank sheet upon which the citizens now could write to create a new form of self-government. In what ways was this a blank sheet? In what ways was it impeded by the burdens of the past? Exactly how much of an opportunity was this after they had won the Revolutionary War in a military sense? We're going to learn all about that. Now, they did have a brief, and really quite a brief when you look at it, historically, honeymoon with the idea of equality that was set down in the Declaration of Independence, this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody, excluding the slaves, which had to come later. We will examine that rather heady experience. Wonderful way to get started. It really could be said to be a honeymoon. You may not know, but you'll find out now, that the making of a constitution to run the country after the war actually started during the war in the colonies about to become states. These folks assumed that at the conclusion of the war, which they would win, there would need to be a framework for self-government, and they started working on it. Almost all the states had constitutions of their own before the national constitution was written, and we will learn about some of those features because some of those features were included, and wisely so, in the making of a new national constitution. Now, there were some economic realities that the new nation had to face, problems which had to be solved in order to provide for the prosperity of the citizens, sort of generally. There had to be economic rules in place. We couldn't just have 13 new republics all competing with each other. There had to be cooperation in some essential ways in the economic sphere. That was one of the ways in which they didn't really start with a blank slate. We're going to examine the economic realities of this new nation. Then you'll learn about some hopeful political reasons why the new United States, if it had the right document to guide its governance, probably had a very good chance of surviving. It might not survive, but it very well could survive. It had to have the right leadership, it had to have the right rules, it had to have the right people, and it had to have the right vision. We'll examine these in more detail. Then we will look at the first experience in national government. It wasn't the Constitution, it was something called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were basically that set of rules that they had all been living by and cooperating with to get through the Revolution itself. It was the set of agreements which persuaded them all to help each other in a military sense and sometimes in an economic sense, just so they could win the war. And the thinking was, at the end of the war, among many Americans, hey, it worked to win the war, why wouldn't it work to keep the peace? So they cobbled up a document called the Articles of Confederation, which was designed to do just that, just carried on the same ideas into the civilian side. We will examine that. Now, this Articles of Confederation government didn't last that long, but it did have some amazing achievements, amazing even to us this day, and we will examine what those were. Regrettably, the achievements did not outweigh the limitations and the weaknesses of this form of government, and so it became very clear very soon that something more comprehensive had to be written down. And we will examine what the exact limitations and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation government were. This leads us to an unfortunate and fortunately brief chapter. In the 1780s, a specter of anarchy actually stalked the land mostly because of the weaknesses of the Articles government and the lack of a centralized authority and a lack of a set of rules by which everyone could agree to work together. This specter of anarchy was serious. It was existential. And when it became so serious, then most of the same people who had helped guide us through the Revolutionary War, people we call the Founding Fathers, decided it's time to do something about this. We have to go back to a major modification of the Articles of Confederation government. So they met for that occasion, and we will learn how that decision was taken and what initially were their steps to do that. But then they soon found out that it wouldn't be enough. It's like putting a Band-Aid over a massive wound, which required a tourniquet and surgery. The Articles just didn't have the pieces and the machinery in order to allow the creation of a functioning national government. So that same meeting, it turned into the Constitutional Convention. They did actually decide we're going to start with a clean sheet of paper, and we're going to create a constitution afresh that we can all live with and we can all live by. That was begun at the Constitutional Convention, and they had a whole lot of work to do. Now we get into the writing of the Constitution. What exactly is new about it? What will they carry over from the Articles government, if anything? And how about these state constitutions that had been written in each individual state? Should we use some of those? Well, yes. Yes, we should. So the Constitution had a lot of moving parts, a lot of debate, and it had a lot of reasons why it should succeed because of all the thoughtfulness that had gone into it. By the way, in this process, they looked at ancient forms of government. They looked at what had actually worked for them during the war to keep the states together. And they looked at various forms of government in Europe. They looked everywhere. They looked at in the history books. They looked at what actually had worked in the past. And they had an understanding that ultimately, for the document to actually be transformed into one that everyone would honor, required a certain set of virtues from the citizenry, a certain set of commitments from everybody to participate. We'll get into all of that. You'll learn all about that. Finally, when they got it all in ink and printed up, they needed to get the agreement of the country, because everybody thought they were over there just to modify the Articles of Confederation and in Philadelphia. Instead, they emerged with a whole new document. Not a big document, by the way. I mean, you can carry it in your pocket. And now they had to get everybody to agree to this. So there began a process of ratification. And they said when 9 of the new 13 states agreed, then we will launch off with this new document in hand, and we will create a new government based upon that. But they knew, really, everybody knew, that it had to be unanimous. You couldn't have a whole country run by 9 of its 13 states. So the ratification process, the sales job, you might say, it did take a while, but eventually they got everybody on board. We will find out in this national debate what the main points were. A book was written about it called The Federalist Papers, written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, in which they set forth all the reasons why this new Constitution should be the law of the land. Not everybody agreed, and so those who didn't agree wrote their own responses in what they called the Anti-Federalist Papers. Difficulties with the Anti-Federalist Papers were that they didn't have anything else to offer. They had nothing better. But they certainly did have some objections that would need to be considered. So an agreement was made that if the country decided to adopt the new Constitution, that their main objections would be included in what became a Bill of Rights, so that the Anti-Federalists' fears would be mollified. So there's your Constitution, and there's your story of how the country went from the victory in the Revolutionary War to the creation of a founding document which could keep the peace and ensure the continuance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for as many people as possible. And as I mentioned a little while ago, including the slaves in that number would have to wait a little while, because that was an omission that turned out to be quite fatal in the short term. We'll get to that much later. Okay, then finally we end up with a brief examination of the essence of the Constitution. What was this essential set of rules written in this quite brief document that guides us still today? They knew it had to be applicable not only to their generation, but also to future generations. How would that even be possible? Well, they did it, and we'll examine why the Constitution continues to be our founding document today. It has no weaknesses. It's as relevant today as it was the first day that they published it. And that will conclude our discussion of the creation of the Constitution.